Hello and welcome to Football Talk by the Two Point Conversion. My name is Dylan Jackson. Today, I'm joined by draft expert Jacob LaQuire. Jacob, today we're going to break down what happened over this past weekend in the NFL draft. Are you excited to get into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, before we get into it, we did produce a draft guide. We've talked about it pretty extensively over the past, I don't know, month or so since it's launched. It's just $1 for a limited time, 90% off. We're going to kind of show a lot of the profiles that we created for this draft guide over the course of today. So, I mean, you can see the cover right here if you're watching live on Twitter or YouTube. And then here's an example of a player profile, Josiah Stewart, drafted by the Rams in the third round this year. So, with that said, after plugging the draft guide, let's go ahead and get into some of our favorite overall draft picks. And we'll start with one of your guys.
Yeah, it has to be the Panthers' first round pick, right? Tetaroa, McMillan, T Mac. I think he was a perfect team fit, with our current receiving core. I think he can push Xavier Leggett to the Z spot. He can be the X spot. And with Bryce Young's strength being like touch and ball placement, and McMillan not ever dropping anything and always bringing the ball in, I think that's a match made in heaven. Didn't reach. I think he was 12th on my board. He was 13th on our board, as you can see on the player card there at the top. Just good value, and I think he fits the team better than quite a few of the defensive pieces that are being talked about at that 8th overall pick.
Yeah, when you look at kind of the landscape of the league and the wide receivers that changed teams this offseason, you've got DK Metcalf and then Travis Hunter, obviously, at the top of this draft. But Tetaroa McMillan is somebody who, is a clear top 10 pick. I think somebody who, 6'5" frame. He's got some surprising juice after the catch. I went back and rewatched a lot of his game today, actually. And, he always seemed to make the first defender miss after catching the ball, which, for somebody of his size, it's just kind of impressive how nimble he is after the catch. It's not something that, I expected, when you're going in watching a 6'5", 220-pound receiver. He's really, really good in that aspect of his game. And he's somebody that I think matches well with Bryce Young in particular, right? The intermediate type of throws that Bryce Young tends to love, the anticipatory throws. That paired with McMillan always wanting to come back to the ball, always wanting to, just make an impact in that area of the field. I think it's a really good match. And like you said, pushing Xavier Leggett to a Z role where he doesn't necessarily have the pressure on him to be that X receiver, I think it's going to really open up his game as well. I mean, we've talked about it a lot, how, Xavier Leggett may not have the upside to be a true number one receiver, but, if you're expecting him to only be a number two type of receiver, I think that's a little bit more fair expectation for him. And I think it's really going to unlock his game and what he can do for this Panthers offense as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if any team can unlock receivers or any coaching staff, it would be the Panthers coaching staff, right? Dave Canales, former wide receiver coach, the offensive coordinator, Brad Idzik, was the wide receivers coach with the Buccaneers before he came here to be offensive coordinator. Just a lot of receiver-minded people on that coaching staff. And like you said, I think if Leggett is moved to the Z, he can be used more in open space, or he can build up his long speed and get after the ball after the catch. Just really good match. And with that and the Jimmy Horn pick later in the draft, I think that really completes a Panthers receiving core that if you looked at it 2 years ago when they had Jonathan Mingo, DJ Chark, Terrace Marshall, like a bunch of wide receiver fours, respectfully. It's impressive to be in the National Football League, but none of those guys were doing Bryce Young any favors his rookie year. And now you can kind of look at the receiving core as a somewhat of a strength on the offense, and hopefully it can continue to elevate Bryce Young past what we saw at the end of last year, where he was really making strides.
You've got 2 first-round picks with Xavier Leggett, Tetaroa McMillan. You've got Adam Thielen and, Hunter Renfrow, who signed after the draft. That was an interesting signing by the Panthers. And then obviously people are really high on Jalen Coker, and Jimmy Horn, I think, brings an element to that Panthers offense that they didn't really have before. They kind of needed somebody who, had some sideline to sideline juice, somebody that you could give the ball on sweeps, design, manufacture touches for. The Panthers really didn't have that. So I'm interested to see if he has, he's only a 6th round pick, but if that gives him a better chance of making the roster than, some of these other receivers taken in the later rounds, which are, more so outside or speed guys. So I really like that pick later on in the draft. Moving on, you also liked the Will Johnson pick to the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, just a good gamble, right? He fell to day 2. A lot of injury concern with the knees. He didn't work out at his pro day. I think he didn't run at any of the 30 visits he went to, but really good talent, right? And so if the medical flags check out, if he ends up being healthy on the field this season, extremely good pick or extremely good value. And I think they got him at pick 47. And for me, he was my 6th overall player on my board. And they took Walter Nolan in the 1st round, who was my 5th overall player. So if they're able to get contributions out of just even one of them, and then Johnson comes along later if he's healthy, really, really good draft for them.
Yeah, when you look at just this Arizona Cardinals offseason as a whole, the investments that they made over not only just this Will Johnson pick, but their entire defense, right? Obviously, Walter Nolan in the 1st round, Jordan Birch in the 2nd round, Cody Simon, Denzel Burke. Those are interesting pieces in the middle rounds of this draft. And then you consider they signed Josh Sweat, they signed Dalvin Tomlinson. This is a team that is really serious about upgrading their defense. And, to get Will Johnson where they did, they desperately needed not just Will Johnson, but, even more than just him in the secondary. Obviously, they drafted Max Melton last year. They have Bodo Baker as well. They just need more pieces overall in that secondary. I think this is just a phenomenal value. All 3 of me, you, and, our content lead for the 2-point conversion, Steve, had a 1st round grade on Will Johnson. So he's somebody that, the 2-point conversion staff as a whole was super high on. So moving on, we have one of my guys, Trevion Henderson, landed with the New England Patriots with the 38th pick. He's somebody that I think gives their offense a dynamic weapon that they didn't really have before. They had, Stephon Diggs. They, had a bunch of, wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 types before that, Hunter Henry, but they were missing a true explosive element. And I think that Trevion Henderson gives them just that. Obviously, his usage is going to be a little bit different than what we saw at Ohio State, where he was able to play in a little bit more space. Things were a little bit easier for him. But I think the Patriots do view him as a potential 3-down workhorse type of running back. And, investing a top 40 pick in this position, I think is serious towards that. So, Henderson, I think is just for an offense that was basically a blank slate in the weapons department. He, I think, is a really explosive start.
Yeah, if you look at their current or their skill position players last season, right? The only person you could say had some juice was maybe Pop Douglas. And in an ideal world, he's your 4th receiver or 5th receiver on your roster. So adding somebody out of the backfield that can have some juice, home run hitting speed, as you see here on the player card, somebody that can take it the distance. And like we talked about with Ashton Jeanty before the draft, take some pressure off of Drake May, right? It doesn't always have to be a receiver that can help the QB. If you're giving a running back, 15 to 25 touches a game, that's 15 to 25 dropbacks that Drake May doesn't have to worry about getting hit or go through his progressions. It's like a mental break, And so having Henderson there who can do pretty much everything. I like him as a receiver out of the backfield. Really good pass blocker as well. One of the best in the class. And then as a runner, once he gets out into the open, can take it the distance. I think it's a really, really good pick. And he should be the go-to guy out of the Patriots backfield to start. But he has some experience sharing the ball, like this past year at Ohio State. So I think he'd be used to taking some plays off and letting Ramondre Stevenson be like a hard hitter in the middle when they need him to.
Yeah, it's kind of a duality of running backs with Ramondre Stevenson as kind of your, I guess, taking the beating type of running back, right? Just somebody that's going to do well on short yardage situations. Then you have your more efficiency type of player, the Jahmyr Gibbs of this backfield, if you will. He's somebody that, took advantage of a lot of efficient carries at Ohio State and I think is in a position to do something similar here for the New England Patriots. So moving on, your other pick that you loved a lot, Jalen Royals going to the Kansas City Chiefs at pick 133, back of the fourth round.
Yeah, I can't believe he made it this far. This was a top 5 receiver for me. He and Matthew Golden were tied in my rankings, so you could say he was my 6th receiver if you wanted to. But really, really good player. Led the entire country in touchdowns of 50 or more yards. So he has the juice. He can take it the distance. They used him out of the backfield some too, like on sweeps and stuff like that. It's kind of covered up, but at the bottom it says, I wrote this one, the comparison is Jaden Reed, and that's kind of how I viewed him coming into the league. I think he can be kind of a jack of all trades receiver, and in a Chiefs receiver room that has dealt with injuries, that has some questions with Rashee Rice, if he's going to play the entire season with injury and maybe a looming suspension. I think Royals can provide some immediate juice and get the Chiefs receiving core back to the explosive group that it used to be back when Mahomes came in the league and he was dropping 50 plus touchdown seasons, 45 plus touchdown seasons en route to, I think it was his first 2 MVPs were when he had over 45 touchdowns. So I think Royals is a big step in getting back there. He fell a little bit because of the foot injury that he had at the I think 4th or 5th game in the season, but he was at the Senior Bowl and seemed healthy there. So if he's fully healthy, I think this is a steal of a receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs. And like we talked about on draft night with the Eagles, some of these teams just continue to get richer by letting prospects with maybe a question mark about health falling to them.
Yeah, anytime you can add an explosive element in the middle rounds of the draft, I think that's a huge win. The Chiefs, I think, are in a unique position to where they're the type of team that typically gives these, middle round selections a shot in year one, despite being a competitive roster. They always tend to be efficient in drafting in those rounds. And I think Royals is going to be no exception to that. Just really great after the catch ability from Jalen Royals. And, with Patrick Mahomes, I think it's going to be a really nice fit. I wonder if it's a little bit of a redundant skill set with, Rashee Rice, with Xavier Worthy. But I feel like when you have 2 guys like that, where, with Worthy, he's a little bit smaller. With Rice, obviously, he's coming off of a major injury. I wonder if this is kind of an insurance policy to that, and a pretty inexpensive one at that. So any final thoughts on Jalen Royals?
Yeah, I think you said it. He can be, if Rashee Rice isn't playing at 100% this year, I think he can pretty easily step into that particular role. He's not as tall as Rice is. I think Rice is 6'3", but Royals has some good size to him. He's a little bit thicker than Xavier Worthy, and he can really be that catch and get 5 or 10 after the catch with good body control. And he's very aware of where everyone is around him, so he can make people miss.
Moving on, I have Mason Taylor, tight end from LSU, going to the New York Jets. Really, this is somebody that I thought could have snuck into the first round, whether it was the Rams at 26, maybe the Eagles wanted a Dallas Goedert replacement at 32. He falls to the Jets at 42nd overall, somebody that I'm pretty high on. I think he's, obviously a young player, only 20 years old. LSU's all-time leading receiver at tight end receptions and yards, if I have that correct. He's somebody that, has Hall of Fame type of DNA in his blood. I think that I really love this from the Jets' perspective, right? Where they were rumored with Tyler Warren in the first round pretty consistently for really months leading up to the pick. They end up passing on a guy like Tyler Warren. They take, offensive tackle Armand Membou. Great pick, right? Really solid offensive tackle. Another bookend that complements Olu Fashanu. They end up with Mason Taylor in the second. And a lot of times I like looking at, what the other options could have been. So let's say they flip, tight end first round, offensive tackle in the second round. You're looking more of a combo of Tyler Warren and a guy like, I don't know, Ariante Ursary, right? It's not as ideal of, a pairing when you could get a better tackle and a really high upside tight end. So I really like the Jets for waiting on tight end to the second round, especially in a class that's really deep. So I think it's a great fit, a great value, in my opinion. I know I'm higher on Taylor than you are, but I really do think it's overall just one of the cleanest fits in this draft class.
What was the last high producer at the tight end position for the Jets? Like, Can you think of it? I can't. Like, this isn't rhetorical. I'm asking if you know. And yeah, exactly, right? You,
Gosh,
you
yeah.
can't really
I
think.
think that, Conklin maybe had one good year with the Jets.
But what was that,
Uh,
like 650 yards maybe?
yeah, probably not even.
Right. So if Mason Taylor can come in and give you that out of the gate, which I think he can, right? Really young, super high potential, and pretty solid player for who he already is. I think that's a really, really good pick. When you look at pass catchers, people tend to gravitate toward receiver, right? Because there's three of them on the field. Those are the bigger name players. But in a class that had such good high end tight end talent and the receiver talent after McMillan and Hunter and Egbuka kind of fell a little bit. I think this is really good value. It should help Justin Fields this year and whoever the future quarterback is with the Jets. And he's not afraid of the big moments. I know when people get drafted to the New York teams, it's like, can they shine under the lights and that sort of thing? If you think back to, I guess it's 3 seasons ago now, where Bryce Young and Alabama played LSU and Jaden Daniels, and LSU won in overtime. It's Mason Taylor who caught the game winning or the game tying touchdown before Jaden Daniels ran in the 2-point conversion. So he's not afraid of the big time moments. Very athletic, technical route runner for being only 20 years old. I think this is really, really good landing spot for him.
You just had me look up Austin Seferian-Jenkins to see what he did with the Jets in 2017. Only 350 yards, so not as many as I was expecting. I think that was the Josh McCown year, if I'm not mistaken. That was pre-Sam Darnold. So obviously the Jets haven't had a tight end prospect like Mason Taylor in quite some time. So I think it's really exciting. And honestly, I think there's an opportunity for Taylor to get a lot of early volume, a lot of early targets as well. This Jets offense, in terms of pass catchers, is pretty barren, right? They have Garrett Wilson, but outside of him, it's like, Allen Lazard, Malachi Corley, who they invested a 3rd-round pick in last year. And now obviously Mason Taylor. So I think there's going to be a pretty early opportunity for Taylor to provide, an over the middle, threat for Justin Fields, who I think really likes going to tight ends.
Yeah, when you look at Fields' best year in Chicago, I think that was a Cole Kmet close to 1,000-yard season, if he didn't eclipse that number when he was there. So I think there's immediate value there. From a dynasty perspective, I think Taylor could be somebody drafted higher than people expect. Same with Terrence Ferguson, the Rams pick, who was 4 or 5 picks after this. But yeah, just really good player, really good fit, and I expect him to produce early. I hope he does produce early.
Moving on, one pick that you did not like in particular, and you'll notice if you're watching on Twitter or YouTube, there is no player card for this player. It's Isaac Tesla. We did not write a profile for him because he wasn't a top 100 player on the 2-point conversion. The Detroit Lions trade a late 3rd-round pick in 2025, as well as 2 future 3rd-round picks to move up to pick number 70 and take Tesla. What are your thoughts on this selection?
Well, you talk about he wasn't a top 100 player. You saw the draft sheet that we used, right? You saw how many wide receivers that I personally watched. It was at least 30, and he wasn't one of them. He was a late riser over the process, and that might have been part of it because I did receivers back in like January. But again, I think there was a lot better value on the board. Jalen Noel was still there. If you wanted somebody in the tall, speedy receiver mold, I think Dante Thornton was still available. The Tennessee receiver was still available at that moment. But for me, it's not so much the player, even though I have high expectations now. It's the process, because you sent 2 extra 3rd-round picks to move up 20, maybe 25 spots in the 3rd round to get this guy. To me, that gives like, all right, I need immediate expectations from this guy if we invested so much in him. And he's going to a team where he has Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Sam Laporta already as 4 pass-catching options. Did you really need to spend 2 future 3rds and your 3rd-round pick this year to move up that 25 picks to select your 5th pass option? I just don't see the vision there.
Yeah, when you look at just, Tesla was taken with the 6th pick in the 3rd round. When you look at the guys at receiver taken after him that fill a similar role too, like this is a guy who is probably going to be a field stretching type of receiver, right? I think Jalen Noel could have filled that role. I think Dante Thornton could have filled that role. Jalen Lane, Jalen Royals, I think both could fill that role better. And
All
these
the
are guys,
Jalen's, yeah.
all of them, they're all taken within 60-ish picks of this. So I don't think that the trade up for a player like Tesla was worth it. B, the selection itself, it's a pretty considerable reach, somebody that I probably wouldn't have considered even in the top 150-ish selection. So I think from every single aspect, it was pretty rough on the Lions. And we'll talk a little bit more about their draft class as a whole a little bit later. So moving on, I had Omar Norman Lott as one of my least favorite selections in this draft. He's somebody that, I get the appeal, right? He's an incredibly efficient interior defensive lineman, especially on passing downs. He had one of the highest win rates. He's very technically advanced, really athletic on, twists, stunts, things of that nature. Somebody that you're going to want if you're, have a defense designed around simulating pressure, right? He is an incredibly talented at that. I struggle with basically everything else about his game. He went 63rd overall in that late sort of, second round range. I kind of expect players selected there to have at least some sort of 3-down potential, right? You want to get some sort of value. And I get that, with Norman Lott in particular, he's somebody that, he easily projects to a role. He's a little bit older, so you can win with him now. It's just, I don't love the process of taking a player that doesn't have even 2-down upside. This is a guy who played basically third and long, and that's it for Tennessee. So I'm just not a huge fan of the process of taking him here, even though I do, as a whole, really like everything else that the Chiefs did.
If you look at his rate stats, so like per snap and stuff like that, this might be the best prospect of all time, right? He's
Right.
consistently generating pressure. He only played like 200 something snaps, but had pressures on like 40 of them. So what, a 20% pressure rate, out of this world, right? But when you project that to NFL level snaps or even half a season of snaps, are you going to get that same consistency? You never know. And I think your point about him not being a 3-down player rings very high when he's going to a team like the Chiefs, who are going to have to replace players that were at least 2-down players, right? Your pro comp for him was the former Chief who left in free agency and joined the Carolina Panthers, Tershawn Wharton. And I think that they can play similar roles in terms of rushing the passer, but Wharton was able to give something in the run game. One of the few Chiefs highlights that wasn't in garbage time in the Super Bowl was Tershawn Wharton tackling Saquon Barkley, not for a loss, for only a 1-yard gain, which is basically a loss for Saquon this past year. But I see what you mean. I think they could have gotten better value here at the 63rd pick. And I think if you are looking at a defensive lineman, you kind of need to get more out of it. I think somebody who went after, and I think we jumped the gun and said he went before during the draft show, but I think Darius Alexander from Toledo ends up going after
Yeah.
Norman Lott, and I think that would have been a better value. I think he could play all 3 downs and could be more of a complete player to slot alongside Chris Jones in the short term and in the future. But I can see if they took him to only be a designated pass rusher from the interior, you probably aren't getting a better prospect at this level in the draft.
Yeah, I mean, he's incredibly talented at what he does, right? It's just, the role and value of what he gives you is just not something that I would personally want in the late second round. I just think that there's better uses for a draft pick like this, right? I love what they did in the third round by getting Ashton Gelati, right? I mean, if you flip these 2 picks, I think it makes a little bit more sense, even though they were only like 5 apart. I still wouldn't have taken Omar Norman Lott in the third round, probably. But I think that, Gelati makes a ton of sense for their defensive line, what they're trying to do in particular. But yeah, I just think they needed more if they were going to draft a defensive tackle in the early rounds of this draft. It just doesn't make that much sense to me. So moving on, another draft pick you thought was pretty rough, another guy that we did not write a top 100 player profile for, is Dillon Gabriel. He went with the 94th overall pick to the Cleveland Browns, quarterback from Oregon. What are your thoughts on, the Browns taking a player that we did not expect to go on day 2?
Well, even if the draft ended at pick like 100 or whatever the comp picks ended in round 3, I still think that this was a bad pick. Dillon Gabriel is under 6 foot. he shades in at just under 200 pounds. So remember the think pieces about Bryce Young's size? Dylan Gabriel's smaller. I think when you look at Bryce Young and what makes him special, like his anticipation, touch throws, ball placement, I think his arm is quite big for someone his size. I'm talking about Bryce Young, and he has some escapability. Dylan Gabriel doesn't have much of any of that. And I know he was a productive player in college for, I think he played 6 seasons across UCF, Oklahoma, and Oregon. But to me, he's just like college productive guy, not NFL traits caliber player. From all accounts, he's a good person for the locker room. And I think the Browns, more than any team, need that kind of player in the locker room. But I think this is a bad pick. Just I don't think he has much NFL upside as a franchise QB. And then tack on what the Browns did on day 3, finally bringing Shedeur Sanders in at the like 144th pick or something like that. And I don't know. If you were going to take Sanders at all, I would rather him have been taken here at 94. And then if you wanted to take Gabriel, do that at 140 or whatever it was. But the whole process of taking Gabriel and then another quarterback is just rough for me. It screams that the owners were involved, at least with
sure.
one of the picks, probably the latter pick, because we saw the faces of the war room after that pick came in. But yeah, even if they didn't take Sanders and we didn't have to hear Mel Kiper freak out on TV for 48 hours, I still don't like the Dylan Gabriel pick. If Shedeur Sanders weren't in this draft class, I still wouldn't like it. You could have taken Riley Leonard, Will Howard, Kyle McCord, any of these QBs, and I would have been more comfortable with it than Dylan Gabriel.
Yeah, it just screams like they're reaching on a quarterback that's likely a career backup and probably only like a rookie contract backup, if we're being completely honest on the level of prospect that he is. Usually, if you're going to take a quarterback on day 2, they should have at least some upside of potentially being a starting quarterback. I don't think there's any of that with Dylan Gabriel. I mean, he was just incredibly risk averse in what he gave you at Oregon this past year. And he's somebody that, like you said, he's not an anticipatory thrower like Bryce Young was at Alabama. And obviously the size is concerning. I think he's probably going to melt behind NFL pressure as well. Like, he had a pretty stout offensive line this past year at Oregon. Josh Connerly just got better and better as the year went along for the Ducks. This is just not a player that I would have taken, honestly, in the first 5 rounds of this NFL draft, and especially not in the top 100. When you have, like, I mean, we could talk about the process of taking 2 quarterbacks in this draft class, especially like, Shedeur Sanders in the 5th round. I don't understand why you would pass on a guy like Shedeur Sanders with this pick instead of, Dylan Gabriel, when, in my opinion, the talent level just isn't even close there. I get why Mel Kiper had his little like meltdown. It wasn't a great day to be a Mel Kiper fan, to be honest with you. But yeah, I mean, I get the off-field stuff with Shedeur Sanders, but I probably would have taken him with this pick instead of Dylan Gabriel, and just not worried about adding some random quarterback to the weirdest quarterback room in the NFL at the moment.
Yeah, I think if you're going to have somebody that's very, very not plus size, minus size, small size QB in the league, they have to be special, right? Kyler Murray, exceptional athlete, right? I think he was the 3rd overall pick in the MLB draft the same year, or he was a first rounder. I know that. Rocket arm. People don't think about it because he's smaller, but probably one of the 10 strongest arms in the league, right? That's how he ends up first overall. Like we talked about with Bryce Young, one of the most anticipatory throws in the league, really good ball placement, and like an NFL caliber arm. That's how he gets first overall. Just none of that's there with Gabriel for me. You talk about him being risk averse. Bo Nix in the same offense had a really high completion percentage, very few interceptions, but at least he was pushing it down the field into tighter windows to Tez Johnson, to who's the guy, Troy Franklin last year. Yeah. I just don't see it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was kind of coddled in a system that is really designed to make him look good, right? And I mean, I would get it more so if this is the 6th round, right? Where you're just looking for a shot at a backup, right? But with this pick, you're expecting him to be like a high level backup quarterback with potential starting upside, and that's not something I really see with Dylan Gabriel. So moving on, we have one of my least favorite picks, and I tend to love, like, South Carolina Gamecocks drafted. and I'll obviously cheer all of them on, but I just thought that the value of Demetrius Knight going to the Cincinnati Bengals with the 49th overall pick, former South Carolina linebacker, it's just not a, you know, pick that I would have made personally. Obviously, super experienced. I think he's going to give you value on early downs in particular. Really good run defending, run fitting linebacker. I really struggle with a lot of the modern game stuff with Knight. I think he's pretty rough in coverage, and you know not somebody that I think is going to match up well with running backs coming out of the backfield, with tight ends, just really, really rough, helping to cover the middle of the field in particular. So obviously the athleticism, the size, that profile is there. He's just an older prospect that really struggles in coverage. And I kind of get why he went this high, just because really after Carson Swessinger, the linebackers in this draft class, just they're not really starting capable guys. They're more role players, and he's probably one of the better role playing linebackers in this class. But top 50 pick, like I don't think you had to reach on a guy that's not worth this pick. I would have rather, with the Bengals, you could take so many guys that would have a bigger impact for your defense, which very clearly needs it. So this Knight pick, I'm not a huge fan of the value.
Right. And then they double up 70 picks later and take another linebacker that I don't think is going to have too much of an impact in his rookie or even on his rookie contract, and Barrett Carter. But I think with Knight, what you see is what you get, right? This can be a guy that can be one of the 120 tackle guy for a couple years, right? And people are like, oh, this guy's pretty underrated, right? He has so many tackles. That's not always a good thing, right? I don't think he offers too much in coverage. I think he's going to be search and destroy as far as like through the line and behind the line, but out in space, don't think he's going to be like Trevor Etienne, the Panthers running back that they drafted. I think that would be a guy that could abuse Knight, or one of these shiftier running backs. He's not catching up to Travion Henderson, right, who we talked about earlier.
No.
This is the classic like thick neck linebacker that can run fit in between the tackles, which I think the Bengals needed, especially with all of their linebackers apparently requesting trades, with some of them falling outside of their prime. Clearly, the Bengals thought they needed to attack this position, going two of them with their top 4 picks. But like you're saying, corner needed help, safety needed help. Even with Shamar Stewart, I think you could have taken another edge if somebody was there. And this was at pick 49. So the 2 Panthers edge rushers both went after this, and quite a few others also went after this. It just didn't match the need, in my opinion. And I think what he offers you is limited. I also think there's limited potential for growth, right? I think he's going to turn 25 this season. And if you watch the draft shows, you heard me talk about how Tyler Shuck's already going to be 25. Well, at least he's not taking a hit or like trying to hit people, right? When your job is to stop running backs and fight through offensive linemen, I think already as an older prospect, that limits how long you can play. So I think I'm capturing all the stuff that you have hesitation on with this pick. And I think it would have been better served to have gone to maybe another D lineman or a secondary piece at this point.
Yeah, really, this whole draft class as a whole is really just not something that I can get behind. Shamar Stewart in the first round, I understand the bet on him, right? I think he's clearly one of the most physically gifted players in this entire draft class. It's just when your defense was so bad last year, historically bad, the amount of yards they gave up, the amount of shootouts that they were in with it felt like with the Ravens and them, they combined for like 200 total points this past season against each other. Just absurd, right? Shamar Stewart is kind of a project and not somebody that I would have considered if I'm the Bengals in particular. I think he made more sense for a team that wasn't necessarily trying to compete right away, and certainly not one that wasn't even a playoff team this past year, right? And then with the Demetrius Knight pick, it almost feels like they swung too far in the opposite direction, getting a guy with just a limited ceiling, only an early down linebacker. Just I don't think that was worth a top 50 pick. Dylan Fairchild, I guess I can get behind that type of plug and play guard is what you're hoping for there. And the Barrett Carter, top of the round 4 for them, that's a guy that I wasn't super high on either. Just seemed kind of like a guy to me at Clemson, just not a huge fan. So really just this pick kind of encapsulates this Bengals draft as a whole. I'm just not a huge fan on it. fan of it. I think that Stewart, we'll see what happens there. Maybe he looks better in a system that, properly utilizes him and other edge rushers. And I think opposite Trey Hendrickson, he could look pretty good. But man, I just the fit there is pretty rough to me in particular.
Yeah, with Barrett Carter, the Clemson linebacker, in preparation for the 2026 class, I've come to not an agreement, but an understanding. If you were a Clemson player that went this year, you just weren't good because all the good players are going to be in the class next year. They could have like 8 different first rounders coming into 2026. Really,
They're
really
ridiculous.
yeah. If they don't win the ACC, pretty big disappointment in my opinion. But yeah, I like the 2 linemen that the Bengals took just because I want Joe Burrow to stay upright. But everything else, I just really can't get behind it.
So speaking of just, some of the least favorite draft classes we had, we'll start off with the negative and then we'll get to some of the classes that we liked. One of the classes that you struggled with in particular was the Cleveland Browns. And am I correct in assuming that a lot of this stems from Travis Hunter?
Yes, that's probably 40% of it, right? I love Mason Graham. He was my 4th overall player, but giving up on a guy like Travis Hunter to me is just super rough. Somebody that can be a body on both offense and defense. And quite frankly, it's even rougher now that we know Shedeur Sanders could have been his teammate. Like there's already some rapport there should Sanders win the starting role. But I like Mason Graham as a player. I just don't like giving away Carter, right? I like Carson Schlesinger, who was the first pick on day 2. I even like the 2 running backs that they took, but it's the process of it all that I just didn't like. Trading away Hunter is the first part. I like getting a future first, but if Travis Hunter is as good as he is, that Jags first isn't going to be good. I liked Carson Schlesinger, right? Probably the only other playable linebacker at that point. But then they take 2 different running backs, 2 different style running backs, I should say, and then 2 quarterbacks to end the draft. They also added Harold Fannin, who interesting pick there. He should play well off of Njoku, but trading away Hunter and then 2 running backs, 2 quarterbacks, I just really can't get behind that process. And like we said earlier with, I'm not going to rehash all the stuff I don't like about Dillon Gabriel, but I think there was a lot of conflicting interests and conflicting parties controlling the draft room, controlling the war room, especially with the multi-QB selection. Not only that, they traded up in the 5th round and sent the rest of their draft capital away to as like the Colts or somebody to get in front of the Eagles, I think, to take Sanders. So Sanders was their final pick. They had 2 more picks, if I'm not mistaken. But to end your draft, running back, tight end, QB, running back, quarterback, like 2 QBs, 2 running backs, I just don't know.
So when I was writing the draft guide, I gave each team 2 grades. I gave them 1 for their actual draft picks, and then I gave another for the process that they took, right? And, it was the Browns and the Falcons that kind of had the biggest contrast between these 2. The Falcons had an A in like the grades that I gave them. I love James Pierce. I love Jalen Walker. I love Xavier Watts, Billy Bowman. I really like what the Falcons did in terms of what they did with their picks. How they went about getting those guys is another question, giving up a 2026 first round pick, blah, 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 right? With the Browns, it's kind of a similar story, right? I like Mason Graham. I like Carson Schlesinger. I like Quinshon Judkins, Dylan Sampson in round 4. Shedeur Sanders, in round 5 is arguably one of the best picks of the draft, just from a pure value to talent standpoint. Right. I gave them an F with my process grade, just because as much as I love those players, I don't love them like I love Travis Hunter. I don't. And I can't quite get over that with them. When you have a ready-made just superstar that you can add to your team, you just take him. And that's my personal opinion. And I get why they made that deal, adding, the pick 5 and a future first and Quinshon Judkins in this class. Like, I get why they did this. Me personally, I wouldn't have done it. Right. So you combine that with the Shedeur Sanders thing in round 5 and Dillon Gabriel in round 3. It's just, it reeks of owner meddling right? When you have two quarterbacks like that, trading above it was rumored that the Eagles might have taken Shador Sanders if they fell to them in the 5th round. Um, I can't get behind that process at all. So I completely understand why they're one of your least favorite classes, even if you do like some of the players. Like I think Quinshon Judkins could be a 3-down back for them, right?
Mhm.
Carson Swessinger, I think, was the last starting capable linebacker in this draft class. And obviously Mason Graham, we talked about him quite a bit. He's somebody that I think has real, Pro Bowl type of upside, but passing on Travis Hunter and then the whole, taking two quarterbacks, taking two running backs thing, it's more so just the process that really messes with me with this draft class.
For sure. They have 5 quarterbacks on the roster now, if I'm not mistaken, right? Watson, they signed Joe Flacco, traded for Kenny Pickett, selected Gabriel, and then traded for and selected Sanders, right? So somebody's got to go. 2 people have to go. They can't carry 4 quarterbacks on their 53-man roster. And then if you envision the fact that they got a future first for next year, maybe going against a franchise guy like Lenore Sellers, if Arch Manning's in the draft, Drew Aller, any of those guys, well, then why the hell did you draft 2 running backs this year? Like, I just don't understand. Like you're saying, owner meddling, too many agendas in the war room when this is an event, the draft, a process where everybody should be in unison, right? Especially if you're taking a position as important as QB. From the top down, everybody has to be in line. And it seems like after the Watson debacle, there's been no stability. Like there hasn't been any alignment from owner to GM to coach in regards to the quarterback position.
Yeah, and one last thing is like they've spent assets on all of these quarterbacks that they have.
Yeah.
So when you consider the fact that they're likely going to enter 2025 the season, I like it's probably going to have to be 4 quarterbacks just because of the assets that they've spent on these guys. Dylan Gabriel's going to be there. They're not going to cut a 3rd-round pick. Shador Sanders, we'll see. I have to assume that he's going to be on the roster though. Joe Flacco is probably the best quarterback for 2025 that they have right now. And then they traded for Kenny Pickett. So they gave up assets for 4 different quarterbacks this offseason. So it's just a little bit, I mean, it's a lot questionable, their whole process. But, moving on, right? One of my least favorite classes that was really in the entire draft. And a lot of people kind of excuse it just because the Lions have, gone against the grain before, right? With Jahmyr Gibbs, Jack Campbell in the 1st round, Sam Laporta, Brian Branch, in the 2nd round. That draft class, just in recent years, they've kind of gone against consensus boards in particular. I thought the Lions just had a really rough draft class. Tyleik Williams was, I think, the worst reach in the 1st round, in my opinion. And I think that type of skill set is something that they could have added on day 2 pretty easily. I mean, Darius Alexander, like we talked about, he wasn't drafted until the 3rd round. And I thought that he honestly was a better prospect than Tyleik Williams, although, maybe not as much upside as him. Tate Ratledge, I think that's a fine pick in the late 2nd round. Still not ideal value in my pick. And then we kind of hammered the point home on Isaac Tesla, where they trade 3 total 3rd-round picks to move up and select him over players that are just frankly better than him. So really the whole process and just the overall value that the Lions got in this draft class, like Brad Holmes is going to escape criticism because of what he's done in the past, but I just really cannot get behind this.
Yeah, and the draft class you talked about earlier, the Jahmyr Gibbs, Campbell, Laporta, and Brian Branch class, that worked out because all of those guys are really good players. I think Jack Campbell's not a really good player, but he's a starter in the league. But Jahmyr Gibbs was a top 15 talent in that class. He's running back 3 at worst in the league right now. Brian Branch was really good. He was just a safety, so he fell out of the 1st round. And Sam Laporta probably caught 30 passes from Iowa that year, but Iowa also doesn't throw the ball. If you extrapolate, it's kind of like Norman Lott. If you extrapolate what he did with the ball in his hands, he was special. I think he was my 3rd tight end, maybe my 4th in that class behind.
He was a good prospect.
Was Darnell Washington in that class? I think I had him neck and neck.
Yeah.
And he ended up falling to the 3rd round. But That class was really good players, and that's why it worked. It wasn't, it just happened to running back was good. No, these were good players before that. Tyreek Williams isn't on the level of any of those guys. Ratledge isn't. I don't think Tesla is either. I think they probably could have gotten Tyreek Williams at that pick in the second round at
Yeah.
the 25th pick in the second round. So that would be what, 61, something like that. And then I just didn't love any of the players on day 3 other than Miles Frazier. I think Miles Frazier's a decent like rotational interior guy, but Ahmad Hassanen, the edge rush for Boise State, wasn't a super big fan. Dan Jackson from Georgia, I'm not a fan of at all. He just seemed like running a straight line safety, and he got torched versus some of the really good receivers in the SEC this year. And then Dominic Lovett has really fallen off since he went to Georgia from Missouri. I think that was 2 years ago that he transferred. So I don't see a lot of late round value. And then the process of the early rounds, I just don't really, I don't like it. It's not my favorite.
Moving on to another NFC North team, we have, one of your lesser favorite classes. I hate saying least just because I don't want to be too overly negative with, a bunch of guys entering the NFL, but you had the Packers as, one of these classes you weren't too big on. So I'll let you kind of explain your reasoning behind that.
Oh, I have a least favorite class. We talked about it like 5 minutes ago with Cleveland, but the Packers, it's really interesting, right? Because I think Matthew Golden, I think he could have been a really good NFL player. Unfortunately, he chose the number 22 as a wide receiver in the NFL. And I can't endorse that whatsoever. I know Rashid Shaheed wears it, but even he's not a superstar by any means. So between Matthew Golden and Savion Williams, who they took in the 3rd round, I think those are both B receivers or wide receiver 2s. And they already have a receiver room full of wide receiver 2s and 3s. So somebody has to emerge. I think they need to probably trade one of their receivers before going into the season, because I think there's a lot of conflicting skill sets. I think Matthew Golden does a lot of what Christian Watson does, except Golden is like healthier, at least to this point. I like the Anthony Belton pick, the NC State tackle, because, and for that matter, the tackle they took in the 7th round, because Green Bay always does this. They get O-line stuff to work out. But the 2 early investments in receivers, which I wasn't a fan of either pick there. And then day 3, at least they took shots on defense. I think the defense was something they should have emphasized earlier. But not going defense at all in days 1 and 2, and then doubling up at receiver when you already have a conflict in the receiver room where there's not a dominant player. I think their best player last year, Romeo Doubs. Is it Dobbs? I think it's Doubs, right? He wanted a trade last year because there weren't enough targets to go around. So if there's 5 of these skill level guys in there, who's to say people aren't going to get frustrated again? I think Golden can match well with Jordan Love, especially like deep or middle, intermediate, and deep middle throws. But I thought they already had that in Christian Watson. Maybe it's like an insurance policy on him. I don't know. Maybe I'm just overthinking it, because the Packers usually find ways for their players to work out. But this was one that had me scratching my head. This one and the Vikings, basically all of the NFC North outside of the Bears.
Yeah, the Golden pick is so interesting to me, because if they're taking a wide receiver in the 1st round, they think that he can be their wide receiver 1, right? Because they already have Christian Watson. They already have Dontavion Wicks, Romeo Doubs. They already have Jaden Reed. They already have all of these B-plus players. So for them to take Matthew Golden, who I think is a different skill set than any of those guys. I think he's probably a better downfield threat than those guys in particular. Like you said, he matches very well with Jordan Love. It's just I didn't really view him as a player that had wide receiver 1 upside, right? I viewed him more as, ideally he's a really good wide receiver 2, right? Just somebody that can stretch the field, give you a really good downfield presence, and is really good at making tough catches in that intermediate middle of field type area. He's just not a player that I really thought the Packers would consider, right? Even Emeka Egbuka, who didn't make it to this pick, I thought would have been a better, I think he had a little bit more upside than what you're getting with Matthew Golden, who I wasn't super in love with the prospect either. He was somebody I had in the late 30s, early 40s type of range. So for him to go at pick 23, I understand the bet. He's, got solid size. He obviously ran an incredibly fast 40-yard dash, but just not a player that I think I considered with the Packers at 23 overall. But I guess I understand it. The Savion Williams one is, he's kind of a gadget player at TCU. We talked about it before the pod. He kind of is in the mold of Cordero Patterson, and maybe he fills that sort of usage of what Patterson was in Atlanta. But just an interesting profile, and probably not somebody that I would take with a top 90 pick. Anthony Belton, I think, is an interesting name, but he was number 100 on our draft guide, and I had him lower than that, I'm pretty sure. So he's somebody that I think at pick 54, just a bit of a reach in my opinion, even if you do think that he could potentially start at, let's say, right tackle for the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah, it's just I keep coming back to the receivers, right? I think, and it's hard to say because obviously Hunter and McMillan go in the top 10, right? And I think those are the only two like easy to see wide receiver one potentials out of everybody in this class. But I think and they said it on the well, they didn't say it, like the announcer, the guy who announced the pick said this is the first time since 2002 that they are going receiver in the first round. And I think if you're going to go receiver in the first round, you probably want a guy with a clearer wide receiver one upside. I think Golden is a victim. I say a victim. He's a victim of the success of the 40 he ran, which always pushes players up the board. But I just don't see the complete first round player there. And then you say Savion Williams. I think they already had a guy that can eat up all the gadget touches in Jaden Reed, who is a more complete wide receiver to this point than Williams is. He can just also do the gadget stuff. So to me, I just can't get over those two. And then they're not neglecting the defense because they had 4 day 3 defensive picks, but I really thought that the defensive front is something they would attack early because they didn't get the juice that I think they wanted out of that group this year.
Yeah, I think, those early date, I say early, but one of them's a 6th round pick in Warren Brinson. But Brinson, Colin Oliver, Baron Sorrell out of Texas. I think those 3 guys in particular are interesting bets early on day 3. It's just, the process of not taking any defensive player in the first 3 rounds, especially when that's where the real weakness of their team was. I get that they've invested a ton of first round capital, a lot of early capital in that defense in recent years, but I think they had to spend something there, and it didn't happen. So I wasn't the hugest fan of what the Packers did. But moving on, I had the Broncos as my other team that I really wasn't huge on what they did. Jahdae Barron, I get the bet on him at pick number 20. A little bit older of a corner at a 2nd round grade on him. I had about 18, 19 first round grades. He was just outside of that, so had him in the early 20s. They take him at 20. That's fine. I really like the process of what they did. I guess I'll start with that with these upcoming picks where, RJ Harvey, they moved down twice in this draft in the 2nd round before taking RJ Harvey, who, I was just a little bit lower on what he was going to give you versus some of the other running backs in this class. So they take him in the very back end of the 2nd round, but still probably a round earlier than where I would have taken him. And then, Pat Bryant in the 3rd round. I think that's something where, a developmental outside physical receiver, he's just very, very stiff, I think, in his route running, and probably not the type of bet I would have made at receiver in the top half of the 3rd round, but I could kind of get behind it. But when you stack all 3 of those, premium, picks together, and that combined with Savion Jones, who I thought was a pretty developmental raw edge prospect from LSU, all of those picks combined, I'm not super high on what the Broncos did.
It seems like after the Barron pick, and I think a lot of people thought he was going to go earlier, maybe like 13 to the Dolphins or something like that. After that pick, looking at it like their draft laid out, it seems like every player maybe went 1 round early. I'm looking at a punter in the 6th round. As much as I love Q Robinson, he's like Omar Norman Lott. He only had like 200 pass rushing snaps this year. Savion Jones, I'm with you. I think was quite developmental. Pat Bryant made our draft guide, but I again think that he's not a guy that's going to compete for a top 2 receiver role within his rookie year. RJ Harvey, like you're saying, really athletic, and you know that Sean Payton loves his running backs because he builds out or inside out. But I think he could have been there in the third round. Maybe when the Panthers made the swap with them, like the four for four pick swap, they got confused and thought that they got a round early on every pick. Like that's kind of where I'm at with the rest of their draft following Barron. And it's funny, every pick that they had following their first rounder was traded at some point. So maybe that was the line of thought there. But I'm with you. It just seems like everybody is just a little bit too early. And I think that for a team that should be pushing the Chiefs this year for the division title, I think they've amassed enough talent to be able to go for that. I don't know. I don't see a lot of high impact players out of this draft, at least in their rookie years.
I like the Barron pick as like, he's an older guy who could give you something, on his rookie deal, versatile corner. And I think that gives them like one of, if not the most talented defense in the NFL. Yeah. But, outside of that, and I'm super just not high on the value of him, that pick 20 overall in particular. I think that there were better values to be had there. Will Johnson in particular, I think is somebody who maybe even if he's not the best scheme fit, just from a talent perspective, I think honestly outclasses Barron. And then, just like RJ Harvey, I think around early, Pat Bryant around early, Savion Jones, probably a mid-day 3 guy to me. Q Robinson, I'm fine with that in the back half of the 4th round, but obviously a punter and, a tight end in the 6th and 7th round isn't going to move me too much either. So I'm fine with the process, right? Like, moving down twice before you take Harvey. I'm glad they didn't just stick and pick him at 51 or whatever they had before. But I think overall it's kind of the accumulation of a bunch of C- picks kind of moves it down the board for me. So we can kind of go to the more positive light now with, our favorite draft classes. And we'll start with one of yours, I should say, the Arizona Cardinals.
For sure. We talked about earlier Will Johnson was one of my favorite picks. Obviously, he fell to pick 47, I believe the 15th pick in the 2nd round. Some injury concerns, but if everything checks out, one of the steals of the draft, right? He was my 6th overall player. In the 1st round, they got my 5th overall player, and I understand that I'm a lot higher on Walter Nolan than everybody else, but his upside is really insane. Like, it's right there with Mason Graham. And I think that with adding Josh Sweat, Dalvin Tomlinson, Jordan Burch in the 3rd round, who's a bigger edge rusher, I think having such a stout defensive front that's been overhauled this offseason, and you factor in Darius Robinson, their 1st round pick, I think 2 years ago now, I think Nolan doesn't have to be like the guy immediately. He can give you the flashes that he showed at Ole Miss this year when he had those flashes. And then you tack on Will Johnson, you tack on Cody Simon, who's a hard-hitting linebacker. You tack on Denzel Burke, who I don't think is the best corner out of Ohio State, but it's Will Johnson insurance, right? And he doesn't have to be in the rotation immediately with Max Melton playing well last year. I think it's not Garrett Wilson. I think Garrett Williams is the other corner that they had. And he had like a mini breakout in the last 4 or 5 games at the end of last season. So this defensive overhaul for a defensive head coach in Jonathan Gannon, I think was number one, deliberate. And I think that each of these players, especially in the first 4 rounds, can have an immediate role for a team that's going to at least try to compete for the NFC West this offseason or this season. I think after the Rams, it's pretty wide open, especially with the Seahawks QB situation. Who knows what's going on with the Niners? But I think that this is a big step in the right direction for getting complimentary football out of the Cardinals. Now it's just going to be up to Kyler to step up to the plate and deliver for the offense.
Yeah, the Walter Nolan pick he's not somebody that I necessarily expected the Cardinals to be in on with that 16th overall pick. I honestly thought that Will Johnson could have been in for them at that 16th overall pick, and they got him at, 46 overall. So I think that's something where it's just a great value, right? Even if Johnson isn't going to end up being like a Pro Bowl caliber player. I think that his floor is still really high, even if he's not the fastest guy in the world. So I'm a huge fan of what they did on the first 2 days in particular. And obviously, I think Cody Simon, Denzel Burke, I think those guys are going to be able to be contributors, at least from, a role perspective, like
Or
just get them on the
special
field,
teams as
special
well.
teams,
Yeah,
right?
they're both
Um,
athletes.
I thought it was funny. They didn't do anything offensively the entire offseason. I was
Yeah.
listening to the Athletic show, and they were saying that Jacoby Brissett was their biggest offensive investment this offseason, the contract they gave him. And then the second was like this rotational tackle that they signed as well. So outside of that, I mean, they're really banking on the development of Marvin Harrison. Obviously, they love Trey McBride. Trey Benson is somebody that's probably going to continue to grow there as well. But I think that the Cardinals really needed to hammer the defense this offseason, and I think they did just that. So, when you have a front of, Josh Sweat, Walter Nolan, Dalvin Tomlinson, and Darius Robinson, I think that's really fun. It's very young outside of Sweat, and I'm excited to kind of track how their defense grows, because 2 years ago, if you looked at their defensive depth chart, it isn't even touching what they have at this point, at least from a talent perspective. So moving on, one of my favorite draft classes, honestly, I think my favorite in total, was what the Raiders did. So, they hit this, likely star level player, despite it being a running back in Ashton Genty out of Boise State. I think they add a lot of really solid players on day two with Jack Besh, Darian Porter. I think at least one of Kayla Rogers or Charles Grant has to pan out just from an odds perspective, right? And then on day three, they just come back and they take a bunch of high upside swings. Dante Thornton, wide receiver out of Tennessee. JJ, I'm not going to pronounce his name right, but the defensive tackle out of Ole Miss, right? Tommy Malott out of Montana State. Incredibly athletic, converted quarterback to receiver prospect. Cam Miller as well, I think has potential to be a backup possibly. And I really love the process of what Vegas did. Obviously, they traded down a bunch in the second round before taking Jack Besh, but I think Besh is a player that could honestly see a ton of target volume in year one as a rookie. And Darian Porter as well. Shout out to Steve, who loves Darian Porter, our content editor. I think, there was some first round buzz after the combine. He's sort of an athletic freak, but to get him at the early third round value, I think that's a slam dunk to me.
For sure. I think what they did was build their infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
After the Geno trade, looking at their offense, was Geno and Colton Miller, and then Brock Bowers, right? Bowers had the phenomenal rookie season, rookie tight end shattering season. He has all the records now. Then you had a bulletproof prospect in Ashton Genty. I think the only
Yeah.
thing that could stop him would be an injury, God forbid. Like I'll knock on my desk is made of wood, so I'll knock on wood. But then trading down and getting Jack Besh, who we talked about, probably the toughest receiver in this class, doesn't drop anything, he probably doesn't love to take hits when he catches the ball, but he does it a bunch and comes up with the ball. Darian Porter, who should be at worst like your special teams ace, once you add him, if he doesn't pan out a corner. And then, like you talked about, they did, looking at it, they did a lot of double ups after that. 2 tackles on day 3, who are consecutive picks, by the way. And then on day, in the third round. Then on day 3, they double up with defensive tackles and Taka Hemingway from South Carolina, JJ Pegues, the guy from Ole Miss, who could also be their fullback this year, blocking for Ashton Genty. They technically double up on QB with Tommy Mellott. He was a QB, but he'll probably be a wide receiver convert in the NFL. And then Cam Miller, the other FCS QB. I believe they actually played against each other in the FCS national championship this year. Mellott won the equivalent of the FCS Heisman, the Walter Payton Award. So really decorated players there. And then if you want to call him a receiver, they doubled up on receiver with him and Dante Thornton, who I think is, if I had to pick a sleeper, like a day 3 receiver sleeper, other than Jalen Royals, it would be Dante Thornton. If Nico Iamalieva could complete downfield passes, Thornton probably has 20 touchdowns last year. Like he was pretty consistently wide open. So really like what they did. I think they're filling out their team quite well, and it's something that they have to do, right? Because they're in a division with the Chiefs. We just talked about the Broncos, who have a tailor-made roster, and then the Chargers, I thought, also had a pretty decent draft. They're doing what they have to do to be able to compete, and I think that this is a good step in the right direction. With Tom Brady is not the full owner, but he's like operating as if he's a major partner. I think they've done a lot of good stuff this offseason.
When you take a running back top 10, I think this is an idea that I've come around on quite a bit as of late. It's really kind of about insulating what you're getting, right? When you take Ashton Genty, you pretty much know what you're going to get. Like Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, you know that you're going to get a ready-made star. It's kind of just about supporting them with the offensive line and infrastructure they need to be an accelerant to your offense. So when you have Genty, when you have Brock Bowers, when you have Max Crosby, Christian Wilkins, the talent I think on this Raiders team is really good. And you add that to, Geno Smith, you add that to an offensive line that was solid, not great, but solid. They're going to have to figure out a lot of their defensive pieces. I think after the defensive line, it can be pretty rough. We'll see what Darian Porter brings to their corner room, but they lost Trayvon Merrick as well. They lost Rob Spillane to the Patriots as well. So I think that they're going to have to rebuild their defense, and it's going to be a multi-year process. But from an offensive perspective, I think that bare minimum, this Raiders team is going to be incredibly fun to watch between Geno, Genty, Bowers, Besh, and then I really do think that Thornton could play a downfield, just a deep threat, space creation role for this offense. He's not really going to give you much other than that, or at least he didn't show anything more than that at Tennessee. So I think it'll be interesting to track, his trajectory as a rookie as well.
I think at worst, Thornton could be a plus size version of Trey Tucker, right? And Trey Tucker was somebody who got a ton of volume for the Raiders last year. Talking about, you mentioned like Genty, the star running back, Bowers, the star tight end. This would be like Sean Payton's favorite skill group to work around, right? It's a shame he has to do it with the division rival Broncos, but I think the Raiders, like you said, minimum fun team to watch. It's not League Pass, right? It's Sunday Ticket, right? Is the NFL version. This could be
we'll just call it League Pass.
This could be the League Pass team this year, for at least for this. No, not League Pass. Excuse me. Red Zone. It's always going to be fun when they show Ashton Genty ripping off a 50-yard run, or Bowers getting a touchdown. And the last thing I'll say about them, you talked about how with these early running backs, you got to support them. Genty's O-line was not very good this year, and you saw it in the games against Penn State and Oregon, and he still made stuff happen. So I have faith that he can make some highlights this year with the Raiders.
Thinking just like the tiniest bit more about it too, the Geno to Dante Thornton connection in particular seems really exciting if he's somebody that's able to get on the field early. Geno, I think, is one of the better downfield passers in the NFL. So to add a 6'5", 4'4" talent is what he ran at the combine, 4'4", 4'3", just incredibly fast player either way. I think it's a really fun offseason that they've had in particular. So moving on, our Carolina Panthers, one of the best draft classes in my opinion. Obviously you agree it's one of your favorite classes you have here on your list. I'll let you talk about it.
For sure. In years past, like since I've been following Panthers drafts, I've always come away like, oh man, this is okay, right? But I could get more. Like a B was the highest I've ever given them. Last year, I didn't like it very much. I give them like a C- or something. But this year, I think this is finally the year that our Carolina Panthers get an A. A lot of the draft grade people out there, none of them have anything bad to say about the class as a whole. Some of them didn't prefer McMillan at 8, but I think this is a pretty consistent top 10 class, right? You had a receiver early who can be a true number one receiver. I believe that between McMillan and Hunter, I think those are the only guys right out the gate that can do it. I think he meshes well with the receivers that are already there. Like he can push Leggett and Coker, and for as much as Thielen's able to give, all those guys to secondary and auxiliary roles, which should help tremendously. Then on day 2, doubling up at edge rusher, right? Trading up both times, but not trading a ton of capital, right? No future picks were traded, just swaps within the rest of the draft. Getting Nick Scorton, somebody who I think a lot of people thought would go at the end of the first round, so they didn't think that he would be there in round two. Got him at I think 51. Princely Uman Mielen, I think it was at 77. I thought he'd go in round two. Real pass rush specialist. Both of those guys,
Yeah.
they're different players, but they both fit needs that the Panthers needs. Panthers need, excuse me, right? Scorton, powerful rusher, good against the run. Lord knows the Panthers needed help against the run, right? And then Uman Mielen, finesse rusher, deep pass rush bag, designated pass rusher, can get the QB on the ground immediately. I think both of those guys can contribute to the edge rush rotation in the rookie year. And then on day three, Trevor Etienne, running back depth, right? Jonathan Brooks got hurt last year, and he has some return experience. Lathan Ransom, Panthers safety group was probably the worst on their team. Now they add another player to that room. Cam Jackson, nose tackle. Ejiro Evero hasn't had a nose tackle since he's been here, and now he has two of them with Jackson and signing Bobby Brown. Mitchell Evans, who was one of my favorite players in the entire draft, was in my top 5 tight ends. I know that might be rich for some people, but every time he touches the ball, something good happens. And then we talked about it at the top of the episode with Jimmy Horn Jr., a speed element who can do some gadget stuff that the Panthers really haven't had since Curtis Samuel. I know they tried to do some with Emir Smith-Marset 2 years ago now, or whenever, I think it was when Steve Wilkes was still the head coach. Wasn't great at it, but Horn can do that kind of thing. And he can be a returner with the punt game and the kicking game now that you need 2 returners with the new kickoff rule. I think all 8 players that the Panthers drafted, none were reaches, and all 8 can realistically find roles within the rookie season to get on the field. And I don't know how many teams can say that about their entire draft class.
Yeah, obviously Tedero McMillan is somebody that we rated pretty highly on the 2-point conversions draft guide. I think there's a chance, outside chance probably, that he's 1,000-yard receiver as a rookie, right? He's probably going to be the wide receiver 1 on week 1 for this team. I think that, he's somebody that has a connection with Bryce Young already before he was even picked by the Carolina Panthers. They were apparently working out together this past offseason. So Nick Scorton, Princely Uman Mielen, I really love these 2 bets doubling down at edge rusher when you very clearly needed some juice. That's something that I think is really going to help this Panthers just pass rushing unit as a whole. Trevor Etienne, I think he's immediately going to be their 3rd down back. Just somebody who's really talented in space, can catch a lot of balls for, Bryce Young. The Panthers really haven't had a true pass catching running back in quite some time. So for them to have, a guy like Trevor Etienne, I think in the 4th round, it might have been a little bit of a reach with the, guys still on the board like Dylan Sampson potentially, but I'm not gonna complain when, in most classes, Etienne's probably a guy that's going to go late round 3, right? So I think it's a pretty solid value there. And then obviously the late round bets that they have as well. Jimmy Horn gives them an element they don't really have with somebody that you can design, manufacture touches for. Cam Jackson, I'm never really going to complain about defensive line depth, especially run stuffing guys with, pretty high floor there. Mitchell Evans, he's I know it's somebody that you're really big on. A surprising amount of juice after the catch with him, despite his, his size being a bigger tight end and somebody who ran like a 4.7 40. He has a shocking amount of juice after the catch with that type of skill set. So I think he's somebody that could immediately fill in on 12 personnel type of formations for the Panthers, who already have a young, exciting, we'll see how he develops, tight end and Jatavion Sanders. But I think the Panthers upgraded a lot in this draft.
With Evans in particular, and you mentioned the juice, he had the fastest 10-yard split of any tight end in this entire class that ran the 40. And immediately is going to be the best blocking tight end on the roster. 6'5", almost 260. I think he came in at 259 at the combine. Jatavion Sanders isn't much of a blocker, and Tommy Tremble, he tries. I'll give him the credit. He attempts to block, but I don't think he's super, super good at it. So to have Mitchell, who can do both blocking and give you a little bit before and after the catch. After the catch, excuse me. I think that's good value in the 5th round. And then, I just think everybody has a role. And looking across the classes, I used your article where you graded all the individual team draft classes, and this was really the only class I could look at and see all 8 players or the entire hall of the class having defined immediate contributions in their rookie season. And for me, that's why it's one of my favorites. I still think the Cardinals is probably my favorite just because the value they got at the first 2 days of the draft. But this would probably be number 2 for me.
Jimmy Horn in the 6th round, I think, is just a especially interesting bet. He's not somebody that I had necessarily linked to Carolina, but I think he makes like a really like a lot of sense where they've been missing an element of that offense where you could get somebody on sweeps, on screens, somebody that you could just find ways to get them the ball in space. They haven't had that. They tried that with God, I think it was Devin Thompson, right? This past year.
Yeah.
And it was not good. They even did it with Miles Sanders a little bit with, some screens, some jet sweeps that they had him, they would line him up as a receiver, send him in motion, and then just hand him the ball. Those touches weren't really good. So for them to add just a shifty, almost a punt returner type of like presence almost, I think that was an interesting bet for the Panthers to make. So any final thoughts on this class?
You brought up Miles Sanders. I think ETN is like a 1-for-1 better option than him on 3rd downs, because if you watched at least early in the season before Sanders got injured, every 3rd down he just came on the field. There was no variation with that whatsoever. I think ETN gives you more juice as a pass catcher on 3rd downs if they're going to do the same thing and like solely switch up who the running back is on 3rd down.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to track just kind of just the Panthers class as a whole. I think just the juice that they added offensively, the pass rushing upside that they added. But moving on, the New England Patriots, I think, had probably my favorite class of the entire weekend. So we started out Will Campbell, offensive tackle, LSU. I think the weapons that they add for Drake May on day 2 between TreVeyon Henderson, Kyle Williams, interior offensive lineman with Jared Wilson was an interesting bet. There's a ton of players on day 3 they took as well. I'm not the biggest fan of drafting a long snapper, even if it was in the late 7th round. But, Mike Vrabel, I think, has a lot of sway, and he's going to get his guys. So Braden Swinson, Josh Farmer, and in early day 3 as well, 2 players that I think could provide more value than where they were picked. So I really love what they did on day 2 in particular, getting TreVeyon Henderson. Obviously, we already talked about him. Kyle Williams, an explosive element to their offense, and then Jared Wilson, who he's a little bit undersized. I wonder if he could play guard for them. I'm not the hugest fan of him as a center in particular, just because I think Georgia had a lot of procedural type of errors that oftentimes falls on center prospects or the center of the offensive line, and he struggled with that at times, I think. But he's an interesting athletic bet at the position that I think in this draft in particular, there really weren't that many center prospects after Gray Zabel. So for them to get him in the late 3rd round, I thought was a really great value.
I was going to say, if you think Zabel's going to be a guard, which I think he probably will with Seattle, Wilson's probably the best center on the board. And that's not propping up Wilson. That's just to speak to how poor the class is overall. I don't think the only other 2 I can think of are Jake Majors and Jonah Monheim. And I'm not sure that either of those guys got drafted. If they did, it was like round 7. But days 1 and 2 were all about insulating and getting Drake May help, right? Will Campbell should be an excellent player at left tackle or guard, wherever they end up using him. TreVeyon Henderson, we talked about earlier, one of the more explosive players in the draft. Kyle Williams, the receiver, another explosive player who can do a lot of good things with the ball in his hands. And then Jared Wilson, even if he's a guard, that's a good thing to add to help protect Drake May. Then after days 1 and 2, it was about filling out the rest of the roster, right? The first couple picks of day 3, Craig Woodson, the safety from Cal, he could probably start immediately. Joshua Farmer, I really like. I thought he was a better value than whatever the 35th pick in the fourth round is. So that's what, around 140. I thought he would go like in the 90s or 80s or 90s. So I like that one. Braden Swinson had a lot of good production, really good run stopper for an edge rusher. And then filling out special teams with the rest of the picks. I kind of wanted the Panthers to take the Miami kicker if they had kept their 7th round pick. Obviously, that didn't happen. And I believe the kicker went before when Jimmy Horn Jr. was taken. But they had a kicker, they had a long snapper, and both of the other guys they added in round 7 can play teams as well. I think this is just a really good overhaul type of draft class. Looking at it, I'm counting up the picks. They had 11 picks, right? And the first 4 probably immediate playing time, right, to help Drake May on offense. And you see how deliberate it was too. All 4 of those picks were offense on days 1 and 2, and then the rest can fill out a defense, which despite getting some big money signings, I still don't think is very good. I think adding to it is a good thing. And then getting some teams players on day 3 or at the end of day 3. I can't hate that because you mentioned a long snapper is never a good thing, and I agree with you. But the intentionality to select a kicker and a long snapper makes me think they want to revamp that entire room, like the entire special teams, or especially the specialists. And if that was the goal, then I can't hate on them for taking let's say the best kicker and the best long snapper instead of waiting till priority free agency when it's a feeding frenzy, right? Where they might get outbid for somebody's services. So if that was the plan, can't fault them there. But overall, I really, really like this class. It was in my top 3. It would have been number 3 for me. So you won't get too many complaints from me on this class.
You talked about the intentionality of it, right? And one thing I kind of want to point out to illustrate this is the offensive linemen that they targeted in particular. Will Campbell and Jared Wilson were arguably the 2 most athletic offensive linemen at the entire combine, right? And that's going to pair well with a guy like Trevion Henderson, who I think is going to work better in a zone blocking scheme anyway. So you pair that with, Mike Onwenu, Garrett Bradbury, 2 zone blocking, building blocks that they had. Last year, a lot of the Patriots offensive line struggles, it came from the fact that they were running a scheme that wasn't matched to their personnel, right? So they changed it back to, what works best with Mike Onwenu. They add in, zone blocking types of players with Jared Wilson, Garrett Bradbury, Will Campbell. They add a zone running back in Trevion Henderson. So I think this running game is going to be exponentially better than what it was last year. There's a lot more, explosiveness to what they added. And I think the overall floor for what you're getting with guys like this, who I think it's going to be a nice, clean fit with a lot of these players. I think it's really, really high. Maybe not like, top half of the league type of high, but I think that they could, win 5, 6, 7 games this year, which, considering what they looked like at times, I think they were probably worse than what their record was in terms of a talent perspective. Drake May kind of carried them quite a bit. They really raised the floor of what they're getting from overall just their roster.
It's functional, right? I think that was the goal this year. Even Hunter Henry, I think, can work as a good zone blocker as a tight end. He's quite mobile and getting out there and working with gaps and stuff like that. It's intentional to get functional, right? The Patriots, before the offseason, because I'm not going to include the free agent signings, probably the worst roster in all of football, right?
Yeah,
despite that, they're let's be quite real. They should have had the number 1 overall pick. They played the Bills backups and they beat them. But even that was a close game, right? It was like 24 to 16 or something. Like, it wasn't a blowout win by any means. So getting, even if they're not elite players, all the guys they drafted earlier are going to be solid starters. And then filling out the depth of their team on day 3. Really, really good work by them. It should make Drake May a lot better, and it should make the rest of the team a lot better and more competitive, right? It's like the Panthers. They don't have to send out 4th and 5th string edge rushers as backups because that's the state of the roster that the Panthers and Patriots have, right? Now they have NFL level depth, and that can help them be competitive moving forward, especially in a division where you're going to have Josh Allen, right? It's going to be cold in the winters, right? So I think if you're going to try to advance in that division, you need depth before you get all the superstars. And I think that's exactly what the Patriots have done this offseason, and in particular with this draft.
Yeah, and just kind of pointing out like their free agency directly complements what they did in the draft too, right? They signed
Mhm.
Carlton Davis, they signed Harold Landry, they signed Milton Williams, Robert Spillane, who we talked about earlier. Those are four starting caliber players, and
Yeah.
honestly have potential to be much more than that. And that's all on the defensive side. And then they come back in the draft, and then their first four picks, all day one, day two guys, offense guys, right? Will Campbell, a running back, a wide receiver, a center, maybe a guard type of prospect with Jared Wilson. So their entire offseason was incredibly planned out. And I have to credit, Mike Vrabel for kind of coming in here. And it seemed that this team didn't really have much of a direction prior to him coming in. And I think that Gerard Mayo wasn't really given the fairest of shots with this team. 1 year with a team that had the roster that it did, it's just not ideal for him. But then again, you look at the talent acquired in last year's draft, right? Jalen Polk was bad. Javon Baker was bad. Obviously, Drake May was kind of gifted to them in a way,
Yeah.
being them having the third overall pick and him being the third quarterback taken. But it's just this team, I think, it's going to be night and day. Just the feel of it. Every single point that they scored in 2024 felt so much harder than it had to be, right? So for them to add so much explosiveness and to raise the floor of what their offensive line gave them, I think that's massive. Do you have any final closing thoughts on not just this Patriots draft, but kind of any other ones you wanted to point out?
I think the teams with young QBs that maybe have something to prove, maybe are continuing to hit their stride. I think a lot of them did a very good job of insulating them, giving them tools to go forward. We talked about the Patriots, the Panthers. We didn't really hit on the Bears, but the Bears also took a tight end at the 10th overall pick, and Luther Burden, somebody both of us are very high on,
Yeah.
really early in the second rounds, giving Caleb Williams options. The Texans, even though I don't like them not going offensive line early enough, even though they took one in the second round, two receivers and an O line to start their first three picks in the draft. So all the players, look at Washington, Jaden Daniels, a lot of needs there, right? But they take a future left tackle, maybe to replace Tunsil, maybe to play right tackle this year. All the teams that have young QBs that I think they believe in have moved very intentionally in supporting them. And that's something I can get behind because we need the young QBs to come up and kind of replace the old guard.
Even teams like the Commanders, who they add Debo Samuel, they add Laramie Tunsil. It's in different ways than spending premium draft picks on
Mhm.
guys like just Ted McMillan, for example. But they've done it in their own way, adding experience type of veterans. And then I think Jalen Lane was like kind of a sneaky addition for them
Yeah.
in the fourth round, who honestly could get a lot of playing time early. They kind of have a spread attack where they have a bunch of receivers on the field at one time. So I think he's honestly one of the more talented players on their roster in terms of the receiver position. But yeah, like I agree with you in that a lot of these teams with young quarterbacks, even if you want to throw Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars on here, they got the best receiver in the draft with Travis Hunter, right? So a lot of these teams,
Well,
Falcons excluded,
I
who
was going to
spent,
say Tennessee as well. Maybe not
yeah,
in the draft, but they gave Cam Ward like not a tailor made, but like at least average O line and free agency with all the movement they did
yeah, I
before
would say
bringing
top
him in.
10, honestly.
Yeah. And then even though he wasn't drafted, they got him his buddy Xavier Restrepo in priority free agency. They got Alec Ayomanor, who I thought
Yeah,
should have been a day two pick. I'm not quite sure what happened there. But even they're supporting him too. And then juxtapose that with like the Colts, right? Bringing in Daniel
yeah.
Jones. Even though they gave him Tyler Warren, they already have issues getting it to all the other weapons. Look at their free agency as well. So it's interesting to see what teams believe in their young QBs and the different routes that they're willing to go to help them in this offseason.
With that, we're going to close out the show. We appreciate everybody for listening. If you're watching on YouTube or Twitter, please follow, subscribe, that sort of thing. You can follow the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts as well. You can follow Jacob at Jacob LaQuire. You can follow me at dj.png, both of those on Twitter. The 2-point conversion on Twitter as well at 2p_conversion on Twitter. Make sure you check out the draft guide. We had a ton of fun covering the NFL draft this year. We put out a ton of content, whether it be podcasts, written articles, our whole draft guide, right? So be sure to check out those resources if you haven't already. And yeah, I'm not sure when the next episode is going to be, hopefully maybe later this week, but it might be a situation where it's going to slow down a little bit in the off season.